When Walt Disney Studios opened to the public in 2002, it was far from the impressive Hollywood theme park in Europe guests had hoped for, with some of the most embarrassing, disappointing attractions in Disney's smallest park. But it did still manage to open with one attraction that impressed guests at Disneyland Paris' second gate. The Moteurs Action Stunt Show Spectacular, later brought over to Disney World as Lights Motors Action, was a thrilling spectacle of fast cars and high adrenaline stunts, and perhaps one of the most insane shows Disney has ever created. And even though both versions of the show have long since closed their doors, they're still sorely missed by fans on both sides of the Atlantic. So let's take a look back at the history of Lights Motors Action, how it came to be, its changes over the years, and what became of Disney's most exciting stunt show. In the late 90s, Disney began work on a new project for their European theme park resort, Disneyland Paris, a second gate. Knowing that they wanted to build a French version of Florida's movie studio theme park, Disney MGM Studios, designs had already been created several years earlier for MGM Studios Europe, on a similar scale as its American counterpart, marking a major expansion to the European destination. In addition to several ambitious new shows and dark rides, MGM Studios Europe would also bring over many of the original park's most successful attractions of the era, and early plans show space for a new version of the Great Movie Ride, a large studio backlot tour with its own New York street sets, and a clone of the popular Indiana Jones epic stunt show Spectacular. At the time, Disney's only attempt at an area their competitor Universal was well situated in, the theme park stunt show, with explosions, acrobatics, and choreographed fights taking place multiple times a day for visiting guests. Unfortunately, by the time it came to actually build MGM Studios Europe, plans had been scaled back significantly. The original park in Paris had not performed anywhere near as well as Disney had hoped, and the financial drain from its poor attendance was having a knock-on effect across the entirety of Disney's theme park business. Several other theme park plans back in America were drastically changed or completely scrapped, and when Disneyland Paris finally found itself in a situation where it could think about building its second park, major budget cuts and reworkings had wreaked havoc on the plans for MGM Studios Europe, and the new park would instead be built under the name Walt Disney Studios. Now, I've already told the full story of how Walt Disney Studios came to be in a much older video on this channel, so I'm skipping over some of the details here. But essentially, Walt Disney Studios cut nearly every interesting, high-budget attraction from the MGM Studios plan, choosing instead to rely on quick and easy flat rides, a handful of indoor stage shows, and simplified clones of a much smaller number of those Florida attractions, some scaled back to the extreme, without any of the charm of the original. And all of this in a park that was the smallest Disney had ever built. But even with the difficulties the park faced, Walt Disney Studios did still have some interesting ideas. Cinémagique was a film starring Martin Short as a park guest, who gets sucked into the world of the movies, journeying through cinema history, making cameos in classic films. And despite the park losing the promise of the Indiana Jones stunt show, Disney would still try to bring a similar attraction to the park, a show that would end up being just about the only must-see attraction on opening day, a show unique to Paris that went by the name Moteurs Action. The show's full name was actually a French-English hybrid, Moteurs Action Stunt Show Spectacular, but for simplicity's sake, for the rest of the video, I'm just going to call it Moteurs Action. One of the difficulties the original Disneyland Paris park had faced when it first opened was a general accusation of cultural imperialism. The idea that Disney was attempting to Americanize France, bringing Mickey Mouse, cowboys, and the all-round tacky American amusement park to the culturally rich city of Paris. Disney had tried to ease some of this bad sentiment by including many nods towards France and French culture in the original park, such as a walkthrough attraction about the French construction of the Statue of Liberty, using the Disney version of a French fairy tale as the theme of the park's castle, and with several references to the French author Jules Verne in the park's version of Tomorrowland, instead named Discoveryland. And in a similar way, the new stunt show at Disney's second gate would be full of French connections. French Disney Imagineer Thierry Coup would be brought on board to be Moteurs Action's art director. Having joined Disney around the opening of the original Paris park, he'd been involved already in the design of Discoveryland, in particular bringing a new French-themed attraction there, Paris's Space Mountain, themed to Jules Verne's book From the Earth to the Moon. Moteurs Action, as the name suggests, wouldn't just be a typical theme park stunt show with acrobats and pyrotechnics. Both of those would of course still play a part, but the key focus of the show would instead be cars, a stunt driving show, with finely choreographed car chases taking place in the park every day, with jumps, drifts, and cars driving on two wheels. Disney would also hire Rémi Julien to work on the show, a legendary French stunt coordinator who'd worked on car chase sequences for movies like The Italian Job, several classic James Bond movies, and the recent French film Taxi 2. To solidify the French connection, the show itself would be set in the south of France, and Coup and other Imagineers took a trip to the Mediterranean coast to scout for inspiration for the set design. The resort town of Villefranche-sur-Mer, on the outskirts of Nice, with its colourful waterfront buildings, was chosen as the main inspiration for the show's design, and Disney would build sets in Paris closely resembling the town. The show would take on the typical behind-the-scenes ideas of Walt Disney Studios and MGM Studios before it, themed as a real production of a car chase-heavy action movie, with guests being invited into the theatre to witness the filming of the key scenes and learn the different tricks used by productions to film car chases and other miscellaneous stunts. The show would be built at the very back of the park, near Walt Disney Studios' heavily reduced version of the Backlot Tram Tour. And when the park opened on March 16, 2002, the newly named Moteurs Action Stunt Show Spectacular would welcome its first guests. Outside the entrance, guests would be greeted by a large sign bearing the attraction's name, and a display of 3 cars. A red car representing the hero of the show, jumping over 2 black villain cars. Passing the entrance, they could get a look at the workshop where the cars were maintained in between performances, as they made their way to a giant grandstand, capable of seating more than 3,000 guests. The grandstand would overlook the stage area, with the recognisable facades of the French Riviera serving as a backdrop for a large empty tarmac space for the cars. In the foreground, there would also be a strip of water themed as the town's harbour. On a big screen in the centre of the Riviera backdrop, the show would open with a compilation of car chase sequences from famous action movies, mostly movies from the last decade that Disney had ownership of, like Gone in 60 Seconds and Enemy of the State. But there were also some other well-known movies, like Speed and the Robert De Niro movie Ronin, which was set in Paris and Nice. After the video ended, the show's host would appear at the front of the main stage, welcoming the crowd and introducing them to the movie that was being filmed. Of course, the movie in production was entirely fictional, and deliberately very little was explained to the audience about what it actually was. But each segment of the show would serve as the filming of a different scene. After a very quick introduction, the first scene would begin, and a red hero car would speed onto the set, pursued by 6 black villain cars. The cars would drift in between and around each other in a flashy sequence of tightly choreographed drifts, as if they were dancing, in a scene that was aptly named the ballet chase. The hero car would fire shots at the black cars, and their windscreens would spark to simulate bullets hitting them. The cars would disappear behind the backdrop, and emerge with the hero car driving in reverse, still maneuvering around its enemies. The climactic moment of the opening scene would arrive when the hero car would be chased backwards across a jump in the center of the stage. Then, firing its cannons, it would hit one of the villain cars, causing it to split in half. The director would yell "cut," ending the first scene of the show. While the next scene was being set up, the film's director and stunt coordinator would talk to the audience, teaching them about the different vehicles, with the main focus being on the red hero car and how it was able to drive backwards across the jump. The crew would reveal that there were in fact two red cars, one with its bodywork flipped backwards so it could just look like it was driving in reverse, and they would switch places with each other when the cars disappeared behind the facades. The design of the cars was, to me, the most interesting part of the show's history. Motors Action was sponsored by the General Motors owned car company Opel, a European car manufacturer commonly seen in France, and the villain cars were Opel Corsas. These are cars that aren't sold in America, but if you're British like me, you might know these as Vauxhall Corsas. Technically speaking though, the cars used at Motors Action weren't real Corsas, as that car is forward-wheel drive and can't drift. So instead, the cars were just designed to look like Corsas, but underneath were actually rear-wheel drive, completely custom designed for the show, with a 175 horsepower motorbike engine placed behind the driver for a lighter weight and also higher, noisier revs. All of the cars also had a special gearbox with 4 forward and 4 reverse gears, which the driver controlled using a sequential shifter. They could pull towards them to shift up and push away to shift down. Twisting the shifter would also quickly put the car in reverse. And one of the most impressive things about these cars was that the transmission system was also custom designed for the show by Disney, who owned a patent for the system, and the gearboxes were even embossed with the Disney logo. According to one guest, who uploaded a video of a backstage tour on YouTube, the show also had a gigantic budget for tires, spending $10 million annually. That number is massive, and it's likely that could be very inaccurate, but considering each of these cars needed completely new tires at least once a day, 365 days a year, a budget in the millions might not be that much of a stretch. After a quick look inside of the hero car, it was time for the second scene, where instead of cars, there would be motorbike stunts. Guests were told this would be the opening scene of the movie, where the main character receives a package the bad guys are trying to take from him. A small number of guest volunteers who'd been chosen earlier would begin the scene, playing scared bystanders running from the chaos, much like one of the scenes from the Indiana Jones show. 2 bad guys on motorbikes would shoot at the hero, who would escape by running into a bike shop at the back of the set. He would then smash through the front window of the bike shop on his own motorbike and shoot another bad guy on top of the roof of the building, who would fall onto an airbag below. Then the chase would begin, with both motorbikes and additional cars chasing the hero. The hero would jump off his bike, running through the harbour, and eventually would shoot one of the bad guys off his bike, causing him to slide through flames on the ground, lighting him on fire. The bad guy would stand up and dramatically flail around before falling to the ground. The director would yell "cut," and crew would rush on stage to extinguish him. This scene was originally also supposed to include a moment where the hero boards a jet ski and goes across that little patch of water at the front of the stage. But during pre-opening testing, a serious accident involving this stunt caused Disney to remove it from the show. This change was made so late into development though, that the jet ski stunt was still seen in the final video. In the transition to the next scene, the crew would first explain how a specially treated suit was used to allow the biker to safely be lit on fire, and then they would invite another guest volunteer, usually a child, to try out a full-size remote control car they used for driverless scenes. They'd be instructed to move the car forwards and backwards using a remote control, but suddenly the car would start moving without their control, and would spin around, revealing it was actually controlled by a hidden driver in a rig built on the left door. Not really a scene that adds any insight into how movies are made, just Disney's excuse to mess with a young kid. Another transitional segment would occur immediately afterwards, as the audience was introduced to an iconic movie car, Herbie the Love Bug, and they'd be shown various clips of the character on the big screen before a real Herbie would drive onto the set. A character that was chosen because Disney owned the Herbie movies. Herbie would drive around for a little bit, before leaving the set and appearing to crash out of sight from guests. He would then re-emerge in two halves, driven by two separate drivers. In the third scene, various market stall props and two trucks were set up for a chase through the town named the Blockade. The hero car would make its return, and two villain cars would show off their ability to balance on two wheels, as the chase would circle around the obstacles. The scene would culminate with the hero car driving up a hidden ramp in one of the trucks, jumping off and landing on a large airbag. Without a major transitional segment, the show would then move on to the fourth scene, the grand finale. Here, guests would be shown how all of the previous scenes fit together to make the film on the big screen. Actually not the scenes that had supposedly been filmed that day, but rather pre-recorded segments of the same stunts. As the film reached its conclusion, the hero car would reappear on the set below, pursued by more villain cars. Flames would engulf the harbour in the foreground, the hero car would disappear behind the set, and suddenly reappear by jumping through a window in the centre of the backdrop and across a ramp to exit the theatre. Explosions would go off all around it, and when they cleared, all of the vehicles featured would then appear on stage to wave goodbye to guests and end the show. Moteurs action did have plenty of rough elements. The final film shown to the audience, featuring none of the scenes they supposedly saw being shot, was a glaring example of the fakeness of the movie studio that was the Walt Disney Studios park. The finale, consisting of only one stunt, was also anticlimactic, and some elements like the guest volunteers felt a bit pointless. But the actual core elements of the show were really strong. In a park that was overall a massive embarrassment for Disney, Moteurs action stood out for being a worthwhile attraction to visit. To put something as difficult and demanding as stunt driving into a theme park where it could be done multiple times a day was a major feat, and the stunts were impressive and exciting to watch. Perhaps one of the most impressive parts about the show, in fact, was the operation that went into custom building and maintaining the fleet of cars. Disney likes to go on quite a lot about how Imagineering is so special because it's a combination of entertainment design and imagination with solid engineering principles. And this show is probably one of the best examples of that. Despite the park's poor reception and difficulty with attendance, Moteurs action was a popular show, and very soon into its operation, plans would be made to bring it across the Atlantic. Over in Florida, Disney World's Disney MGM Studios needed to solve a problem with its backstage tour. The combination tram and walking tour had been one of the main attractions when the park had opened in 1989, lasting 2 hours and taking guests through New York backlots, special effects demonstrations, and indoor sound stages. But by 2002, the tour was a shell of its former self. Very early into operation, the walking and tram segments were split up into their own separate attractions. And a couple of years later, a large part of the New York Street area was removed from the tram tour and pedestrianized, as new attractions were added to the area. One of the only remaining film sets on the tour was the park's Residential Street, a row of suburban houses used for exterior shots. Residential Street was technically a real filming location, but it hadn't seen much in the way of serious production since the park had opened. And one of the few major sites, a house used in the filming of the TV show The Golden Girls, hadn't really been relevant since that show had ended a decade earlier in 1992. The area was getting to be very tired and outdated, and Disney needed to come up with a replacement for the street. Conveniently, Moteurs action in Paris already sat next to Walt Disney Studios' own version of the backlot tour, in more or less the same relative location. Bringing the show over to the Florida park just made perfect sense. And so in 2003, Residential Street became the latest thing to be removed from MGM's backlot tour, as it was fenced off and demolished. And in May 2004, Disney announced that the show would be opening at Disney World under the new name Lights, Motors Action, Extreme Stunt Show. The show would arrive at MGM Studios the following year, opening as part of Disney's Happiest Celebration on Earth, a promotional event held across all of Disney's resorts, marking the 50th anniversary of the opening of Disneyland. Disney World would mark the celebration by bringing over a new attraction from each of Disney's other resorts at the time. Magic Kingdom would receive a new castle stage show brought over from Tokyo Disneyland. Epcot would open Soarin', a clone of Soarin' over California from California Adventure. And Lights Motors Action would of course serve as the import from Paris. A larger 5,000-seat grandstand was built at MGM Studios. The set would be almost an exact copy of the original, with one of the only real differences being a building on the side that was painted the same color as the Golden Girls house, as it stood in the exact spot where the house had been. Naturally, the bilingual presentation that Motors Action had in Paris was also removed. Disney made a big deal about the show being brought over from France, with the newly translated version of the iconic entrance sign including a subtitle proudly declaring it as direct from Disney Studios Paris. And on May 5th, 2005, exactly a year after it was first announced, the new American version of Lights Motors Action opened to Florida guests. With the new version of the show, Disney took the opportunity to experiment with the format. All of the same scenes were included, and it was pretty much what guests had seen in France 3 years earlier, but the order of certain scenes and the transitional segments were rearranged to try and balance out the pacing. The show would begin as normal with the ballet chase scene, but the motorbike and market scenes were switched, with the Herbie segment taking place earlier into the show. This way, each of the gaps between the major scenes had their own transitional segment, rather than having most of them taking place one after the other. The inclusion of guest volunteers to play pedestrians was also removed. The only other noticeable difference was that the jet ski was finally brought into the show. The show was also no longer sponsored by Opel, as despite it still using their courses, they were a company that didn't sell cars in America. So instead, the show was sponsored by Brawny, a manufacturer not of cars, but of paper towels. Lights Motors Action continued into the late 2000s without much change. At some point after opening, the entrance sign had its direct from Paris subtitle removed, and the hero car was added to the display to more closely resemble the original. But no major changes were made to the show itself. Despite how high risk it clearly was, the show also managed to operate relatively safely. It's still fair to call it the most dangerous show at Walt Disney World because of the risk involved in the stunts, but it never suffered any major incidents like you might expect from an attraction of this nature. Because of the size of the stage, it wasn't necessarily that high speed, and the skill was more based in precision movements and control of drifts than it was in high-speed reactions. That being said, it did still have the occasional mishap. The entire spectacle hinged on the abilities of its drivers. They were all very experienced stunt drivers from film and TV. Practicing for the show took the better part of a year, and drivers were in constant communication during every performance to sync up their moves with one another, using various reference points around the set for braking and turn-in. If you were slightly out of sync, it was easy to adjust, and you can see it in a lot of the performances that cars pause at various points to allow others to catch up. But every now and again, bigger mistakes would happen. All it takes is a quick search on YouTube of Lights Motors Action crash, and you'll find plenty of moments where cars collide with the walls or with one another. One of the biggest occurred in 2014, when the hero car went over the final jump too fast, and ended up shearing its bodywork on a crossbeam on the truck. Usually, for safety reasons, an incident like this would mean that Disney would have to end the performance early, with the director hurriedly waving everyone goodbye as the vehicle and its driver were checked on. The next change to both shows came in 2011. When it arrived in Florida, the Herbie segment was quite convenient, as a new Herbie movie had come out that year, and he had also featured on Residential Street, so his appearance served as a kind of tribute to that area too. But with the 2011 release of the Pixar movie Cars 2, Herbie was removed from Lights Motors Action, and his segment was replaced with a new one featuring a life-size Lightning McQueen. who would drive around on a secret mission to defeat an enemy spy, guided by Mater on the big screen to catch and blow up another car carrying a rocket. In 2012, Moteurs Action in Paris celebrated its 10th anniversary, and in 2015, Lights Motors Action in Florida celebrated its 10th anniversary. But that year would bring an announcement that would put the show in danger. Disney had already closed the neighbouring backlot tour in 2014 to make way for the new Toy Story Land expansion, leaving Lights Motors Action as one of the only remaining attractions in the area. And in 2015, Disney announced the development of a new Star Wars land at both Disneyland in California and the now named Hollywood Studios in Florida, a massive undertaking seeking to make one of the most detailed and immersive lands yet, and one that was pretty obvious where it would go. The land, later revealed as Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, would be built at the back of Hollywood Studios, right where Lights Motors Action was. In early 2016, it was announced that in April of that year, the show would permanently close. The version in Paris would stay for the time being, but on April 2nd, 2016, guests descended on the Florida Theater for a special final show. The final ever show began with the entire crew making an appearance to wave goodbye to guests. The show mostly ran as normal, although with lots of the crew watching the scenes from the patio at the side of the set. And for the final scene where the hero car jumps out of the central window, rather than its sliding out of the way, the car instead simply smashed straight through it, making for a more dramatic finale. Finally, the entire cast and crew came out for one final emotional farewell, and the following day, the show was closed permanently, torn down later in the year as construction for Galaxy's Edge began. Meanwhile, at Walt Disney Studios, the original Motors Action continued operation. Although now at nearly 15 years old, it was starting to show its age, especially in a park that was gradually trying to shed its original lackluster image. Since 2007, it had sat in the shadow at the park's Tower of Terror, a clone of the smaller version of the ride that also existed at California Adventure. In 2014, the park had opened a new Ratatouille area, marking a shift away from the park's Hollywood theme. And as the end of the decade approached, questions were being asked about further changes Disney might make to Walt Disney Studios. In 2018, Walt Disney Studios announced its next major expansion, a multi-part €2 billion expansion to the park that would add a new Marvel Avengers area, a Frozen Land, and Paris's version of Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. Most of the backlot area of the park was scheduled to be either heavily rethemed or entirely demolished, including the tram tour, rock and roller coaster, and Motors Action, which would be closed permanently to make way for the new Star Wars area. In 2019, with the closure still scheduled for the future, Motors Action continued another year of operation, and in April it held a special event as part of the show, as the park was visited by the Renault Formula One team, who performed a show run with one of their older cars to promote the upcoming French Grand Prix in June. I mention this event because I think it was quite important, as the car was driven by Renault Academy driver Antoine Hubert, who only a few months later was tragically killed in a severe Formula 2 accident in Belgium. Motors Action's closing date hadn't been made official, but in March 2020, the entire resort in Disneyland Paris was forced to temporarily close because of the pandemic, and Disney decided that when it reopened, the Stunt Show would not return. And so on March 13th, 2020, just 3 days shy of its 18th birthday, Motors Action closed permanently, without any fanfare. Throughout 2020, construction at the park was delayed, and the planned openings of all the new lands were pushed back. The first new land finally opened a year behind schedule in 2022, the Avengers Campus, but the world of Frozen was still a long way off, and it seemed pretty apparent at that point that the Galaxy's Edge clone had been completely cancelled. But Walt Disney Studios was still operating, now with an even smaller roster of attractions than in 2019. And so a few of those semi-closed areas were hurriedly repurposed as easy, temporary attractions to fill out the offerings. The remains of the tram tour, basically just the Catastrophe Canyon area, reopened as the Cars Road Trip, and eventually in 2024, the closed Motors action stage was repurposed for the new stage show Alice and the Queen of Hearts Back to Wonderland, an incredibly weird musical show with a new set built out of colourful shipping containers placed directly in front of the existing French Riviera facades, a mixture of dancing, acrobatics, and BMX stunts for some reason, essentially a much cheaper stunt show. As of 2025, the Alice in Wonderland show still sits pasted on top of the old Motors action sets. The show is due to run to the end of August 2025, and it's unclear what will follow in 2026. Unfortunately, the construction of the bay for the world of Frozen encroaches into some of the old behind-the-scenes areas from Motors Action, so there is no chance of a return to the original show. In Orlando, Galaxy's Edge opened in 2019, and the ride Millennium Falcon Smuggler's Run is approximately where the old theatre used to be. But there is still one reference left to what came before it. Outside the Black Spire Outpost Marketplace are 3 speeder bikes. The green bike in the middle has 3 small letters on its side in the fictional Arabesh alphabet, which translated read LMA, the final remnant of the now long gone Lights Motors action. Although born out of a deeply flawed park, Lights Motors Action was a well-executed and really impressive stunt show. It's easy to overlook just how insane of an undertaking it is to make driving stunts work day in, day out at a theme park. And aside from visiting a racetrack or maybe a monster truck rally, I struggle to think of many places where you can see this sort of thing happen up close. This is an attraction that I saw only about a month after it opened at Disney World, and I saw it several times after that at both locations and with both its Herbie and Cars versions. It's always been one of my personal favourite Disney shows, because I'm really into cars and motorsport and high-thrill stunts. But at the same time, it did fall short in some ways. It promised guests that it would show them how these types of Hollywood stunts were filmed for their favourite movies. But it sort of didn't. Because of the limitations of a theme park, and the need to do these things multiple times a day, a lot of the set pieces were actually done differently to how they would have been done in Hollywood. And this is so obvious when you watch the final product at the end of the show, because all of the stunts shown on the big screen are done the right way, differently to how you saw them in the theatre. When the motorbike smashes through the window, it breaks through the glass. Except in the show, it just smashes through plastic panels that were designed to be easily put back together. When the car jumps off the truck, it lands on the ground, not on an airbag. And when the man falls off the roof, he falls through the roof of a car. Obviously, all understandable concessions for a repeatable theme park show, but there's still things that feed into that general vibe of fakeness that Walt Disney Studios had. But what did you think of Lights Motors Action? Did you visit in Orlando or Paris? And which version did you prefer? Let me know in the comments. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, as there are always more videos about theme parks coming in the future, and as always, I'll see you next time.